It's Thursday, 11 o'clock. It's time for this week's Watch Drop. Today, I've died and gone to neo-vintage heaven, and that's the theme for this week. We've got so many amazing neo-vintage watches from Audemars Piguet, Daniel Roth, Patek. I should probably start by defining neo-vintage. It's really a term that I think A Collected Man coined probably 5 years ago or so. And there's some vagary about what it actually means, but I see it as the watches created in the 70s, 80s and 90s. They're not quite vintage, they're not quite modern, but they fall somewhere in between. And they're watches that were created in low numbers with really, really interesting characteristics about them. Things that you don't necessarily see today and things that you didn't necessarily see before. This is window of really interesting watches that have become very collectible in the last couple of years. It can't just be me, but I've realised an emerging trend of collectors starting to look at pocket watches, neo-vintage pocket watches. They were produced in the 70s, 80s in really small numbers. People weren't really buying pocket watches back then, so they weren't a product that AP were producing in very large numbers. There was no real audience for it, no demand. 50 years on, we are looking back at those pocket watches, not the stuffy yellow gold enamel dial bits, but more the open worked, the white metals that are really capturing collectors' hearts and minds. We have an amazing example of a 70s Audemars Piguet on the table today, and I'm going to explain to you why I think it's so special. I'm going to dive straight into this because I just can't help myself. It's staring at me on the table. This piece here is a 1970s Audemars Piguet pocket watch. We talked about skeletonization last week with JLC Art Deco, and that's a very, very impressive watch. There's no two ways about it. It's sold in a flash. This takes that skeletonization and cranks it up a notch. It comes from a time when Audemars Piguet were producing really, really interesting things. We've got some others here that we'll talk about, but just starting with this one, I have to just listen to it for a second. I'll put it on the mic. You hear that? It is such a romantic, interesting sound. I could listen to it all day. It'd probably be a little bit off-putting to listen to it all day. But I love the idea that a rakish, dapper gent would be out on a night in the town and after a few gin and tonics, sort of pulls it out of his pocket and says, "Oh, it's probably time I should get my taxi home." You know, I love that. I think... I don't know, it's probably just me. But I follow companies on Instagram like the Pygmalion Gallery in Singapore, and they have found such incredible examples, and this would be right up there with them, I have to say. Go check that site out. You'll be convinced that this is the way forward or the way backwards. I want it so much. It's absolutely a realm that collectors can jump into as a bit of fresh interest, where perhaps the same things have been coming to market for such a long time. I think this breathes a new breath of life into watch collecting because it's a fascinating design. The bridges are all skeletonized and engraved in a way that it's a quality that I've never seen before, I have to say. And I've seen a lot of skeletonized watches, and this is unparalleled. It's a very legible thing. When you get it in the right light, you see those hands that are blued, that just sparkle in a way that the main skeletonized caliber below it doesn't. So it's not an illegible thing. It is something that you can really use to tell the time quite easily. This is from that neo-vintage era where no one was buying pocket watches, but Audemars Piguet put so much time and effort into producing something so wonderful. It's real artisanal watchmaking and something that just wouldn't be created today. So I love it. Please go and check it out, and also check out the Pygmalion Gallery in Singapore too. So moving on, back to regular watches. I've been a little bit cheeky because I saw this in the pipeline and I thought it would complement the conversation. So this isn't in the watch drop this week, but it absolutely echoes a lot of the design of the pocket watch that we've just talked about. This is an Audemars Piguet neo-vintage gem. It's the largest skeletonized wristwatch that they've made. It's 34 millimeters, and many of them are 32 millimeters and below. So it's really nice to see a modern-sized wristwatch with this design. Now, this has the ultra-thin JLC movement, which is engraved to the nth degree. It's lovely to see that spinning around, and I mean, wow, it's captivating, this thing. It really is. But it has so much of the design that you see in that pocket watch that Audemars Piguet have carried through the generations. I love it. I had to talk about it, even though it's not quite available for sale until next week or possibly the week after. Brilliant thing. And if you are interested before it's released, do let me know and we'll find out what price it is. So we've been talking a lot about Audemars Piguet, and when I think about neo-vintage, that is the standout brand. It makes me a little bit sad in a way, because when you think about modern-day Audemars Piguet, everyone thinks about the Royal Oak. Royal Oak, Royal Oak. And if you look at something like this Audemars Piguet Cobra, it couldn't be further from the Royal Oak design, and yet it's something that the brand as we know it today would never release. It just wouldn't ever be released in the modern day, and I think that's really sad. I have to talk about this Cobra because everything about it, from the bracelet and the interior of the clasp, it's completely over the top, and I love it for that. It's obviously white gold. This is the largest, what's called a jumbo Cobra, with an automatic movement. It's actually the same caliber that's in that skeletonized watch that we were just talking about. So it's ultra thin, has a nice automatic script on the dial that I think works really well alongside the sans serif Audemars Piguet print that we know from early Audemars Piguet. But the design of the bracelet, which is completely integrated and not something that you can remove, it's actually not something that you can easily size, but it does have some quick adjustment, or quickish adjustment on the clasp itself. When I put this watch on, it just changes my mood completely. I know it's brash, I know it's in your face, but I'd absolutely wear it. It just makes me happy. And the dial is almost monolithic with the bracelet. I know it doesn't have the same texture, but it does have the same color. And so you have that uniformity that flows throughout the bracelet that makes it feel like a piece of jewelry. I adore it. And it's heavy and it's just beautifully made. This is watchmaking from a time when real care and attention was put into the products that were being released. And I really miss that era of Audemars Piguet. Interestingly, from the same collector as the skeletonized AP wristwatch, we also have one of my favorites, which is an AP Quantième Perpetual. Now, this isn't just any AP Quantième Perpetual. This one is executed in platinum. It's an edition of 70 pieces. And when you see the box set, which is something that we'll take photos of when we have a moment, you'll be blown away by the attention to detail. It's an enamel green box with a little key that opens it up. Even the pusher that comes with it is knurled in a way that makes it feel like it's done by Bentley. It's a crazy thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful watch in stunning condition. And when you think about the AP Quantième Perpetuals, a lot of people think about the 25657 reference. This is not that. This is a slightly smaller format with the sort of teardrop lugs. It's sculpted with a stepped case. It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. I think the dial is enamel, and I love how the blued hands of the subdials just pop against that crisp white dial. Oh wow, I want it. This is another one that's cheeky and it's not actually in this drop, but do reach out if you're interested in it because we are going to do an unboxing video just of this thing. It's spectacular. When I think about the perpetual calendar complication, the watches that I think of are the 3940 from Patek and this watch actually. And the commonality between those two is that somehow the architecture of the watch is able to show you in a clear way an awful lot of information. You've got the date, you've got the day, you've got the year, you've got a moon phase, and that's an awful lot to show on a dial, particularly in this case, which is a 35 or 36 millimeter form factor. But yet it doesn't feel overwhelming. You're not off-put by the complexity of what's being shown to you. In fact, there's an awful lot of spare room on this dial somehow to enjoy that crisp white enamel that sits behind the complications. And it's those perpetual calendars that portray that information to you in a way that's not over-facing, that really work. They're the watches that I think of and want and lust after when it comes to perpetual calendars. And again, AP in the 70s, 80s, 90s did that so well with such flair. It's a great thing. I'm going to touch on a couple of neo-vintage gems from other brands. One that we don't see very often that has recently been reignited by the LVMH group, and that's a Daniel Roth. This example here is one of the earlier examples. It's a time-only piece, but it has that standard Daniel Roth case that you know and I love. It's a circular watch with the sides trimmed off that give it this sort of, it's not tonneau, but it's tonneau-esque shape. Some of the dials from Daniel Roth, I think, work and some of them don't. When you put too much information into them, I think, with the complicated case construction, it can be too much. It can be a little bit overwhelming. But this example is very simple. You have hours and minutes portrayed on the main dial, and then you have a small subdial for the seconds hand. And the seconds don't even have any indices around them at all. You've just got this beautiful guilloche pattern. And the main dial itself has got these Roman numerals that work perfectly with the spear-tipped hands. All of it just comes together in a yellow gold case, a grey dial with blued hands, and this amazing tang buckle that feels like a sort of extension of the top of the case. It's those little details that make these watches work so well. And I'm going to say it again. This is where modern watchmaking has lost the plot somewhat. Modern Rolexes are robust. They do what they say on the can. But when you look back at neo-vintage, it feels like a more playful and fun era when watchmakers got a little bit more creative. They had a bit more creative opportunity. And they weren't sort of managed by these large conglomerates that possibly reduced that ability to be creative. The Daniel Roth is a great example of this, where case construction is really interesting. Everything from the lugs, the dial, the tang buckle, even the way the rotor sort of flies out the edge of the case, out of shot from the sapphire. It's playful. And I love it. This is a great watch. And all of these on the table that we've talked about so far make me extremely excited. I love them. I want to move on now and touch on a couple of interesting modern watches. I want to talk about HODINKEE Limited Editions, special editions. HODINKEE is a brand that we all know and love. I think they've done some fantastic things. They've been a market maker in themselves. We've all read and heard from them over the years and learned so much. But one of my favourite things that they did was to work with the brands to create really special limited editions. Some of the limited editions that they've done over the years that I've loved, the Vacheron Comte de Vache is the best. I love that watch. They've done some really interesting Zenith. They've done, you name it, they've worked with them. And they've always added some design flair that's just for the watch enthusiasts, people that know those nerdy little details and love them. On the table, we've got a couple here that are really quite rare and really quite interesting. I'm going to start with the Tag Heuer. Now, I should just say Heuer. This is a Heuer skipper, and it was produced with HODINKEE in an edition of 125 pieces. What's really special about this is the lengths that HODINKEE have gone to make a watch that harks back to that 1967 skipper that was made in commemoration of some boat. Intrepid, thank you. In 1967, the Intrepid, which is a beautiful boat, won the America's Cup. And in celebration of that, Heuer created a skipper watch that looks 99% the same as this, but without a date. And HODINKEE, being the collectors and enthusiasts that we know and love, decided that they wanted to produce a modern version of that. And they've used exactly the same colour palettes. The form factor is slightly larger than that original 70s, actually, 36mm case. This is now 39mm and feels much more of the modern times. And they've added the date complication at 3 o'clock, but you've still got that beautiful colour palette. I think this watch is all about the vibrancy and the colour palette that make you feel like you're out on the ocean on this wonderful yacht, enjoying the sunshine and enjoying winning boat races. I love it. There's no two ways about it, and it's a collector's favourite. I mentioned that there are a number of different HODINKEE limited editions that they've produced over the years, and this is one of the absolute most popular ones. Because the attention to detail and the accuracy in which they've recreated the original 60s, 70s skipper is a great example. I hope it finds a home with a collector that's going to appreciate it for what it is, a very special recreation and limited edition of a very cool watch. Tag Heuer recognised the impact that watch made, and they produced a version for the masses. I mean, they haven't made gazillions of these things, but they are made in much bigger numbers than 125. This example, really interestingly, is executed in rose gold, and I love that. I love the fact that you have this sporty tool watch in precious metal. And I also love the contrast between that vibrant blue dial and the rose gold of the case. It's also interesting that they've moved the date from the 3 o'clock position down to 6, and you've been given these pump pushers, which feel more modern, slightly less retro, but slightly more pleasing to push. I don't know. I like them. It's a really good watch. And it's fascinating that the values of the precious metal are very similar indeed to the steel recreation from HODINKEE. Both really interesting watches to have side by side. I mentioned that we've got a couple of HODINKEE limited editions, and the next one and the last one is a really special one. This is a Tudor Black Bay that was produced for friends and family of HODINKEE. So you have on the dial Tudor, Geneva, and then this bright stamp for HODINKEE. Now this was a very limited edition of 100 pieces, and I'm really pleased to say that this has come from a very important person in that journey, in that part of HODINKEE's history. I'm not at liberty to say who it is, but I can tell you it's a good one. So go and check it out. These very rarely come to market, and this one is a very, very special example. So please do take a look. I truly think that there's a real link between these limited edition collaborations that we see in modern watchmaking and the neo-vintage times, and the watches that we've talked about earlier in this video. When I look at the collection of limited editions produced by HODINKEE and by others, last week we talked about the Subdial limited edition for JLC. It reminds me of that creative spirit that we saw in the neo-vintage watch world from AP, from Daniel Roth, from Pat. And I hope that that spirit continues in the modern world. There's always a time and a place for interesting tool watches, dress watches that do what they say on the can. But I love that era, that segment of limited editions that are built for collectors, for enthusiasts, for people that love these things and that understand their history and want to honor it. So that's this week's drop. Over 70 watches hitting the site and a real plethora of watches from the neo-vintage era, some vintage stuff, and of course some modern pieces from everyone, including Rolex, Panerai, AP, Chopard, all of them. Please do go hit the website, check it out, and I'll see you next week.